Hello and welcome back to the CU Cinefiles After Dark. My name is Matt.
My name is Zeke.
And today we're looking at the 2018 horror film Mandy, starring Nicolas Cage. Yes, Nicolas Cage in a horror film.
Remember that.
So what you gonna do with that thing?
I'm going hunting.
So what you hunting?
It's crazy evil.
You think you're so in love? I'll show you love.
My initial thoughts when I heard Nicolas Cage in a horror film is like, this dude did National Treasure. How is this going to be a horror movie?
Well, it's an interesting thing because it's like his madness kind of fits in with the whole movie. Like, he's crazy, but the entire movie is crazy.
Oh, absolutely. And I was absolutely blown away by Nicolas Cage's performance in the film. He basically displayed just the whole spectrum of emotion. And
yeah, and he's known for showing a lot of aggression and anger, and that really works because, overall, this is a story of vengeance and a story of just primal anger, and he just fits in so perfectly with that. His performance, everything he does, just really fits into the story and the world.
Oh, absolutely. And you said it's a story about vengeance, even though it's a lot about vengeance, but also there's a big theme of grief, considering he just lost the love of his life. Murdered.
Yeah.
Quite violently, actually.
Yes, very much. And that specific scene is just quite, it's gruesome, but also you can't take your eyes away from it. Just like Nicolas Cage's character, Red, who's tied up while his wife is burning in front of him, and he can't look away.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised by the amount of just brutality in the film. But I felt like it really added to the film as opposed to taking away.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the whole aesthetic of the film is so unique. It's like watching that film is the closest I will ever get to taking drugs. Ever.
Because everyone in the film is on drugs.
Yes, especially literally there are all these drugs in his killing spree. Nicolas Cage's character literally just takes the cocaine and just sniffs it like it's nothing.
A comical pile of cocaine.
Yeah, it's insane. Just everything in this movie is at the top level in the best way possible.
And the interesting about it is that it's almost two movies in one. Because the first half is very slow, calm, building the relationship.
Yeah, very serene.
It's not until halfway through the movie that they show the title card for the movie.
Yeah.
And that's the real turning point of it. And the film really refuses to be defined.
It's like, we describe it as a horror film, but it's a lot of things. Like, at the beginning, it can almost be a romance. And then later on, it takes aspects of horror, but also aspects of, like I was saying, films about revenge. Also a bit of, the slasher film, but rather than there being a slasher, the main character, Red, is basically the slasher of the film. The murderous rampager with psychic powers, no less. And it's interesting because you can almost see this movie as something from the perspective of the slasher. And a lot of slashers in movie history have been made sympathetic characters over time. Like, if you know backstories of Jason Voorhees, who was bullied as a kid and killed, but the movies don't really take that step into actually making that character the center point, the focal point of the movie, whereas Mandy really does show that person who was just ruined. His perfect moment in life was just taken away from him, and it caused him to take the route of the slasher.
Yeah, I actually read an interview with the director, and the director actually based the character Red around Jason Voorhees.
That makes a lot of sense.
So you can see a lot of, from the slasher genre in it, and so many of the subgenres of horror that almost seem contradictory to each other. A lot of it is psychological, but you also see more of the slasher, and it even gets semi-torture porn with the amount of gore in it.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing about the aesthetic is the huge influence of heavy metal and heavy metal album art, which is very prevalent throughout the whole film. Like all of the title cards are very much in metal, kind of those like that metal fonts, and even the giant axe that he forges himself looks like a guitar, especially when he like wears it on his back. It looks like a huge guitar that he uses to slice people up.
And it's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of the movie in general is based around heavy metal. Like the soundtrack is often a lot of heavy metal. The aesthetics in general, like you said, reflect heavy metal cover art.
Yeah, there's even this one shot where like this guy randomly releases a tiger, and then you have this beautiful shot of a tiger like roaring against like the pink sky and the moon. And even in the final moments when he's driving away and you look up at the sky and you see it looks so like alien and like a painting. And those kinds of aesthetics really ground that whole feel.
And you can almost say it's almost reflecting what it's like in the life of a heavy metal performer. How you have the drugs, like the snapping out of reality. It's a lot of like Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue, who was addicted to drugs and died of a heroin overdose, but was brought back and never was the same afterwards. You see a lot of that reflected in this movie.
Yeah, definitely. And you do get the sense that after Red has gone through his whole rampage of vengeance, and after he has achieved his vengeance, you get the feeling that he's not going to be the same, because he still has his loss, he still has his grief, and even as we were mentioning with the final shot, the entire world changes around his rage. Even this, just everything will really reflects that grief that he feels.
Yeah. And definitely a big turning point in the film is the point where he takes the bit of LSD and just his world is forever changed because of it. And the use of drugs is a big part of the film, not only in its aesthetics, but the ramifications of it. After that first hit, he's gone for the rest of his life. Even though it does help him throughout the film, afterwards, there's no going back.
Yeah. The other aesthetic thing that I want to point out, besides heavy metal, is fantasy, high fantasy, because obviously heavy metal album art does take a lot of inspiration from fantasy. And there are a lot of nods to fantasy throughout the movie, like with the book that Mandy is reading about the warlock and the serpent. Actually, I don't know what that book is, but it definitely alluded to a lot of like fantasy stories that I read. And also, even going back to like the guitar blade, is that him forging the blade is really something out of like a Lord of the Rings or the start of a quest, and his crossbow is also could be considered like a fantasy like weapon.
And the interesting I found is that in the first half of the movie, when Mandy is alive, you see a lot of Mandy like really being into heavy metal, with her wearing like heavy metal shirts, like you said, reading all those fantasy novels. And in the second half, when Red's kind of lost his mind, the whole world kind of becomes that. We are literally in Mandy's world.
Right.
So even though she died in the first half, she's there the entire film.
Yeah, she's just pervasive, because that's just how much she means to him.
When you break it down, it's a very simple plot line, but the way in which it's conveyed is kind of hard to follow the plot, but it's less of a narrative-driven story than it is an experience.
Definitely. And yeah, this is one of those few films where I feel like the aesthetics will reach a certain point where it's going to affect the plot, it's going to enhance the plot. Whereas normally, I was even thinking about this earlier today, I think some aesthetics serve purposes in films, but ultimately the actual story and the plot will take the steering wheel, and that will determine whether the movie is good or bad, and aesthetics will kind of be a flavor. But with this film, it's really takes center, and it's really gonna make the movie.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you all for watching so much. This episode of See You Cinefiles After Dark of Mandy probably should have been named Red's Dead Redemption. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all in the next video.
We didn't say Nicolas Cage nearly enough.
No, we did not.
All right. Awesome.